Well, actually, I didn't retire. I called it repurposing.
Right, repurposing, exactly.
That's when I began to write the book. And my inside joke is I worked at HOK exactly 50 years. And I tell my friends it took me 53 years to write the book, 50 years to learn what to write, 1 year of really good research and interviewing of current and former colleagues, and then a year of very long year of writing, and then a long, long year of editing.
Mm.
But it took 53 years to learn what to say in the book. Uh, and as I look back on it, it's a dream. I could never have imagined when I was just out of grad school looking for my first job that I would find a place like this, like HOK, and grow up with the firm as the firm grew up, and go through all of the job positions in the firm, and literally have a whole career inside of one place, and end up from junior designer to the CEO. It was an incredible journey, and also I've seen the world. I mean, I typically flew 150,000 miles a year.
Wow.
Been to every continent except Antarctica, and met clients from all over the world. So it's been an incredible journey, and it's worth writing about. Most people write books about the work of the firm, which is appropriate,
Right.
and only a few have written books about, well, how does a firm actually function? How do you start a firm, and how do you keep it going, and how do you hand it off to another generation, and so on. So it was a stories that were worth writing about.
I think your observation about architecture books is totally accurate. And also you come from a very unique position. So hearing these insights is even more valuable. And what I liked about the book too is that it's incredibly sincere and honest. There's not a lot of pretension. You talk about the flaws and the struggles in an open way. And that also seems indicative of HOK itself.
Yes, thank you. That's a high compliment. The firm was always a place where people, well, it started out as a firm, just one office when I joined in St. Louis, an unlikely place for a great firm to spring from. But the three founders were extraordinary men. And one of the things that they fostered was inside that first office was something we all came to call HOK culture. And HOK culture was like a big family. We were all there to help each other succeed, with the idea that we would collaborate inside the firm in order to compete outside the firm. Very simple.
Yeah.
But we had that initially, and that culture, as the firm expanded, exploded really in growth to multiple offices across the country and then around the world. That culture eroded because people in the new offices, maybe they didn't even know the founders, and they weren't what we call vaccinated with the culture. So when I became the CEO, that was my third goal, which is to get the firm glued back together again, restore HOK culture so that we were like a much larger now virtual big family. And that process took many, many years. The simplest things were to repair some of the leadership and fix some of the operations, but restoring the culture took years. I'm happy to say we did it.
Yeah.
And the firm is, I think, stronger than ever. And I'm very proud of my successors and how they're conducting themselves, including during the coronavirus. So the firm is prepared for the ups and downs that the world throws at us, the economy and the virus and the 9/11 and so on.
Right.
And it was born that way. It was born after the Great Depression, which seared the lives, and the Second World War, which touched the lives of all three founders in certain very special ways. So it was born from adversity. And so the founders wanted, especially George Hellmuth, they wanted this firm to be able to outlive themselves and to be able to overcome the boom and bust cycle that is typical in the architectural practices.
Right.
and still is today, actually.
Yeah, for sure. Take us back. So you have a Bachelor of Architecture and a Master of Architecture and Urban Design. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. University of Illinois, with a side trip to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and the American Academy in Rome. I had a delightful year living in Europe. I bought a Volkswagen Beetle at the factory. That was the car of choice for college kids. I got it at the factory in Wolfsburg, Germany, drove it all through Europe, and then shipped it home. And that car, I loved that car, and I drove that car for more than 100,000 miles. I don't remember exactly, but that was, and there were a lot of funny stories about the car. When I came to St. Louis from Champaign, Illinois, which is a 3-hour drive, I was a college guy, and I did a typical guy thing. I didn't have much in the way of possessions. They fit in the back seat, but I had a mattress, and I knew I needed the mattress to sleep on. So as a guy would do, I just threw the mattress on the top of my Beetle.
Oh, no.
Wrapped some binder twine around it to hold it down, and drove to St. Louis. And when I got there, the front of the mattress was coated with bugs. A typical guy thing. That was the beginning of my career at HOK, is to clean the bugs off, get an apartment across the street from the office, and report for work.
Yeah, had you had a woman in your life at that point, maybe she would have been able to point out that it was a bad idea to do
that.
I'm sure that she would have. I didn't meet the woman of my life until I met her at HOK.
Right.
The love of my life is also an architect. And I didn't meet her until 3, 4, 5 years after I started. I met her in San Francisco. And by then, I was transferred to San Francisco to help open the first HOK branch office out of St. Louis. And we got very busy after a tough start. And my boss at the time hired her to be my assistant. And she's an architect. She's also a fellow, as I am. We're very proud of the fact that there aren't too many couples that are both fellows, but we are. And so she... I didn't know that he had hired her. I was away on a vacation with my family, my parents and my brothers and their families. When I came back to work, I saw her in the office, and it was one of those things, I swear, I knew that she was the woman I would marry.
Really?
And it was all I could do to keep from going up to her and giving her a big hug and say, "Will you marry me?" So I had restraint. I didn't do that.
On day one.
That's right. I introduced myself. She didn't know who I was, and she thought maybe I was a product salesman that had come in the office to sell windows or doors or something. So we worked together. She as my assistant for a very short time. Then the office leadership discovered she had much more talent. They took her away from me and gave her her own work. She was the first woman in the firm, because part of the journey I've been on is architecture started at HOK as almost entirely men. And then women began to enter the practice. My wife was one of the pioneers, and she was the first vice president of the firm that was a woman. And that all worked out really well until she became pregnant with our son, Patrick, who's now 42 years old. And she took a maternity leave, decided she wanted to be close to him, so she opened her own practice in our house. And she has that practice to this day. So we've really juggled family and career, but she understands totally. When I would come home from work, she would totally understand how the day was and what happened, and she knew the characters in the firm. So we were quite connected. And our friends advised us, don't marry another architect. Don't design a house together, which we did. We live in it to this day. It was one of the most glorious experiences of our lives because we learned how to work together before we fell in love and got married. And it's the most natural thing in the world to know someone than to realize, both of us, I knew from the beginning, but it took her a little longer, that we loved each other. And without ever actually having a date, we had a conversation and decided to get married. And so that marriage is now 45 years young, and we're still very much in love, and we've got 2 children and 3 beautiful grandkids.
Oh my goodness, what a wonderful story. You see the things that happen at HOK.
I know.
I like to say that, again, it's cultural, that HOK has provided pretty much everything for me. A career, a whole series of job opportunities, world travel, and I met my wife. What more could somebody want than from a firm than that? And
Yeah.
I did not expect to stay at HOK when I joined the firm. I'm from Illinois, not too far from St. Louis, Missouri, and I wanted to go somewhere in the West. I wanted to see what the rest of the country looked like. And I joined HOK because I interviewed at some other firms, in SOM in Chicago, Cambridge 7, which was one of the luminary firms in the day in Boston. And Cambridge 7 offered me an unpaid internship, but I needed a paying job.
Yeah.
I didn't have any money left. And SOM Chicago was a very good office, but I didn't like the rigidity of the feel of it. But HOK felt, to me, when I went in for my interview, just electric. There was a buzz in that office of people working together, and just conversations all over the place, and people running back and forth to conference rooms. And I thought, wow, this is an exciting place. Maybe I'll work here for a while. I'm sure I'll learn some good things. Maybe and work long enough to get my license, because in those days you had to work for 3 years before you could take your license exam. And then I'll go out west somewhere and hang up my own shingle and become the next Frank Lloyd Wright. And every time I got an itchy foot to want to leave, HOK opened another door, provided another opportunity for me. They gave me an opportunity to travel. Then they moved me to San Francisco to help open the first branch. And I had never been west of Denver. Again, I'm from the flatlands of the Midwest. I didn't see a mountain until I was 16 when we went to the Rockies. And I'm a little bit embarrassed to say I had not seen the ocean until I was about 15 years old. Saw the ocean at Florida, which almost doesn't count.
Yeah, a little bit different from San Francisco.
Yes. Well, when I went from St. Louis to San Francisco, everything was different. In St. Louis, the air was never crystal clear blue. It was always a milky blue if it was blue. And the buildings, you couldn't possibly have a white colored building in St. Louis, because buildings got dirty because it's an industrial area. In San Francisco, the water was sparkling blue. The sky was what I call bullet blue. It was so blue that you could almost poke at it and it would shatter like some fine china. And the buildings were white and they glimmered in the sunlight. And I live in Marin County across the Golden Gate Bridge, and one of the great joys was driving across that bridge every day to see what the city was like, shimmering in the morning or in the evening, with the different sun angles and the fog and so on. I think it's the most beautiful city in the world, and I've seen most of the cities for its scale and its setting on the bay and so on. So I think I'm the luckiest person in the world. HOK brought me to San Francisco, where I continued to live, and HOK brought me my wife, my family, and provided these 50 years of experience and a lot of opportunity.
Yeah.
So I'm most grateful. And the book is intended to be, if you've read it, it's intended to be helpful to others. It bothers me that architecture is such a struggle, that people who love design, who love designing buildings or things in and around buildings, to have such a struggle just to practice
Yeah.
We didn't go to college to learn how to run a practice. We went to college because we loved to design buildings. And what I learned when I got inside of HOK is architects, including at HOK, we were inventing how to run a practice from the beginning, starting with the founders. And as the firm grew, we had to invent more things to keep us going. But we started with a good foundation of the founders, and then the book is about my journey and the firm's journey to how we grew. We got into trouble because we grew too fast. We lost our culture because we hired people in new offices and didn't seed them with HOK people that had the culture. So we made many errors, but fortunately, and it's okay to make mistakes, it's not okay to not address them and take care of them.
Right.
So
right.
Big part of my journey was fixing things. The founders gave us this fantastic start. And if I may, I'd like to just talk about one of them. I'm going to talk about all three, but George Hellmuth, the founder, was 10 years older than Guillaume Obata and George Casabon. And George Hellmuth was the only one of the three who was born and raised in St. Louis. And he was the son of an architect, also named George Hellmuth. And his father and his uncle, Harry, also a Hellmuth, had a firm together, Hellmuth and Hellmuth, what else? And George, growing up in St. Louis, watched his father and his uncle struggle, get a job, hire some draftsmen, no computers then. This is early 1900s. At that time, St. Louis was the fifth largest city in the U.S., and it was filled with activity from people, the westward flow of people from the East Coast to the West Coast and so on. And so they were busy, but they didn't know how to stay busy. So they would get a job. Whichever of the brothers had gotten the job insisted that he be the one to design it, which is pretty typical of partnerships.
Mm-hmm.
They would hire some draftsmen and do the work. And about the time the work was finishing up, they began to think about getting the next job. Well, often they weren't able to do that. And so at the end of the job, there would be no new work. So they would lay off all the draftsmen. And I do mean men. It was draftsmen in those days, early 1900s. And it would be back to the two brothers. And young George remembers in his childhood, when they got a new job and the money was flowing from the fee, the family was prosperous.
Mm-hmm.
And when the money stopped, the family was never poor, but there were times of belt tightening. Young George Hellmuth, the founder of HOK, described it as a roller coaster, up and down, up and down. And that was a searing experience for him. He wondered why a firm has to be that way. And isn't there a way to have more of a steady upward trajectory of a firm? The other thing he observed was that his father and his uncle, even though they were brothers, they didn't actually get along that well. Both of them competed with each other. Each one insisted on designing his own work. If I win the work, I'm the designer, and you have to help me. And then it would reverse. And he thought there had to be a better way. Then he had the last straw for. We called him Papa George Hellmuth, young George Hellmuth in this story. He graduated from a good private university in St. Louis, Washington University, and wanted to join his father and his uncle's firm, but he graduated in the year 1930. And for those of us who think the coronavirus is the worst, biggest, baddest thing that's ever happened, it was nothing compared to the Great Depression.
Hmm.
The virus closed down the U.S. and the world starting in March. And here we are in October, and that's 7 months old. And we hope that some kind of vaccination is around the corner so we can go back to living normal lives. The Great Depression began in 1930 and actually didn't end until 1941, 11 years.
Wow.
Young George Hellmuth couldn't go to work for his father and his uncle because they had no work. he wrangled a job with the city of St. Louis to design comfort stations and bus stops and park benches in the park and so on. And he did it for 6 long years. Every year he would go back to his father and his uncle. Can I have a job now? No, we can't hire you. So finally his father said, you have to leave. If you want to practice architecture, we can't teach you. We don't know how. You're going to have to go to a bigger city, find a big office that knows how to work, knows how to practice, and get them to take you on. So he did. He left St. Louis. This was in the late 30s. Ended up in Detroit, Michigan, which was at that time a rival to Chicago for dominance in the Midwest. Mm-hmm. And Detroit was, of course, the home of the auto industry. There was the biggest firm in town was Smith, Hinchman and Grills. That's the predecessor to today's Smith Group. And Smith, Hinchman Grills, SHG, was busy serving the auto industry. And they were designing assembly plants and office buildings for the big 3 automakers and so on. And George Hellmuth, much like I did, began as a junior designer working at SHG. But he was a natural salesman. He loved the idea of marketing and selling work. And that caught the attention of the leadership there. So they gave him a job to help with some, they called it solicitation, putting together proposals and things like that. And as he began to work there, he realized SHG was big, but they had no more idea than his father and his uncle how to keep a sustainable practice, how to be resilient. So he came up with a series of 4 principles and wrote them up, had them typed up, no computers then, typewriters, 22 pages, single-spaced. He was very fond of saying single-spaced, with 4 principles for a resilient practice. And I'll just summarize them. The first one is that if you want a sustainable practice, you have to be able to attract good people and keep them long-term. Why? That's the key thing to this the whole strategy. Getting and attracting and keeping good people means that you can train them up, and if they are good people, they will rise in the firm and become more and more valuable and help you compete even more effectively for the next job and so on. They're the key to sustaining a practice. So how do you attract and keep good people? That's the first one. The second, you have to do full-time marketing. You have to have a steady workflow of work, and that means that somebody needs to be totally dedicated to marketing. And this was in the late 40s, early 50s. This was unheard of. Architects were professionals. We architects shouldn't advertise. We should sit by the phone and wait for somebody to call. Mm-hmm. And Hellmuth thought that was bunk and said so. And he says, if you have a full-time marketing with somebody focused on it, backed up by some kind of a public relations program to get the word out about your firm. In those days with print media, it was getting published in a magazine or a newspaper. These days it's social media and podcasts and so on. So his third principle was the ideal firm would know how to design and diversify what it knew how to design and never stop diversifying. When HOK was founded, and there's a long story that between Hellmuth coming up with his paper and not, I would just tell you this, when he presented his 22-page single-space typewritten paper to the bosses at SHG, they weren't interested. They couldn't see the value of it. They just wanted that next job.
I find that sorry to interrupt you. I find that so bizarre because, the narrative or the description of an architecture office being a roller coaster is dead on. Yeah. It's something that every architect knows and has felt, is still feeling for a lot of architects, unfortunately. And so it does, him kind of not being heard by the partners at that office led to HOK, which is great, but it shocks me.
Yeah. I mean, had they said yes, Hellmuth would have ended up, I'm sure, as the CEO or president
Right.
of SHG, and SHG would be the biggest firm in the world. They couldn't see it. They were so focused on getting that next job, because what he said was, you can't do this overnight. He described marketing as farming, and he said it takes years. First, you have to till the ground. That means cultivate a client. Then you have to plant the seeds. Then you have to nurture the growth of the plant. And finally, after all of that, you get to harvest. So he said you can't expect to put a plan into place and bear fruit in 1 year. He said it takes 5 years to make this work. I think that's what put off SHG. They said, we don't have 5 years. We need a job in the next 6 months. So let me just tell you his other principles, and then I'll tell you what happened when they said no. Hellmuth's third principle, which is also a key, is about diversification. He said a firm should deliberately focus on designing many different kinds of buildings, so that if the school work that is mostly prevalent, he could see the school work eventually fading away as the baby boom after World War II faded away. And he positively worked to get the firm to land some other kind of work, which is, we call that pioneering marketing. You market a client for work that you've never done before, but persuade the client through charm, earnestness, and friendship to give you a chance to design a new building, a hospital, an airport, a jail, a commercial building, to expand the portfolio of the work that the firm knows how to do. That was the third. Well, there's more. Diversity extended to geography. He said, he founded a little firm of his own finally after SHG said no thanks. And they started in Detroit. And he took 2 SHG colleagues with him. So all 3 quit, started their own firm, a little office in Detroit. And the fourth principle that Hellmuth projected had to do with watching his father and his uncle argue and fight over who was going to do what. So he said, in our new firm, we're going to divide the responsibilities so that we're going to have special leaders. One leader will market and just market. The second leader will just design. The third leader will just lead production. And so he started this little firm in Detroit, Hellmuth, Yamasaki, and Lineweber. Joe Lineweber was a chief production architect at SHG. Minoru Yamasaki, that you will know as the designer of the World Trade Center that was destroyed in 9/11. He was the one that Hellmuth brought to SHG to raise the design quality. And then he's the one that Hellmuth removed from SHG to join him in his little partnership. So they divided the work among the leaders, and Hellmuth's idea of this was, if you do something every day and just that one thing and concentrate on it, you get pretty good. You get really good if you do over years. So have each partner focus on something. And he didn't say this, but I learned through interviews and talking with his children afterwards. Part of it was he didn't want to see the partners in a firm fighting each other over who was going to get to design the next building.
Right.
So again, 4 principles. They're still in place in HOK today. Attract and keep people. I'm the poster child. I started as a junior designer with no idea I would stay, and I stepped down 50 years to the day and had this full career from junior designer to CEO, and watched the firm, was witness to all of this change from 1 office to 27 locations, from drawing by hand on paper to drawing with computers, and from local work to work that it was routine and normal for people to fly in an airplane around the world to get to the client. I saw it all. And again, that's why it seems so compelling to write this book, because I'm a bridge between the founders and the people today.
Right.
And the funny thing is, when Hellmuth and Hellmuth was practicing, the average architecture firm was about 8 people. And you know what it is today? About 8 people. We mostly, as a profession, haven't learned how to get ourselves out of that box of struggling from job to job.
Right.
And my own view about this is that the world needs great architecture. It needs design more than ever. I mean, if you look at this thing, this is a beautiful new iPhone 11 Pro. Just got it. Love it. Probably the best design work, far better than any architect practicing today. Why? It's elegant looking, but it also just works like the slickest thing you can imagine for putting the whole world in one hand. And it's so affordable that millions of people around the world are using smartphones. This one's on the pricey side, but you get the idea that the buildings that we're designing now are not as well designed as this or automobiles or airplanes. They're also too expensive and they don't perform so well. And that's all about good design. And we need to gear ourselves, to organize ourselves differently so that we step up our game, because we're not serving the needs of society with great design thinking. Instead, I think architects are pushing themselves. They're playing defensive architecture. Design is in the back seat, and in the front seat is taking plenty of time with working drawings and specs and so on to keep the contractor from having our lunch and so on. And if that rings a bell, I bet it does with many people. We're practicing the wrong way. And I think unless people think about how to practice, we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes that Hellmuth and Hellmuth had more than 100 years ago.
And actually, that's why, the title of the book makes perfect sense. It's, what is it? It's designing. Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. We design buildings, but we really need to put the same attention to designing our practice.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
I mean, these 3 men, Hellmuth, Obata, and Kasabam, set out to design a firm that would grow. They had outsized ambitions. They didn't just want to make a living. They wanted to actually reach the world with their design work. And they wanted a firm that would outlive themselves. So this is, again, in 1955, in 1955, HOK was founded by a split up of Hellmuth, Yamasaki, and Line River. There's another good story there. But HOK was founded as a corporation instead of being a partnership. Partnerships tend to live and die with the career of the founder. Corporations that sell stock don't necessarily, they don't have to live forever, I guess, but they're not limited to the founders.
Yeah.
As long as there's a proper provision for allowing new, younger people to buy stock, it's an automatic process. We're on now the 4th generation of leadership at HOK. And the one remaining founder who's still living, which is Gio Obata, 96. He's in failing health, but couldn't be more proud of what's happened. Because the firm is actually living out the dream that the 3 of them had, which is to build a firm that was resilient, would get through all these ups and downs, and grow to the point that people got really good at the work that they were doing instead of just good enough.
Right.
And I think we all need, as a profession, to think of ways to become, not just to survive the coronavirus, but how to take back the world of design, because right now I think people in our society think of building design as almost, I will say this word, frivolous. Gee, it's expensive, and do I really need an architect? Can't I just get a contractor to build me a building? Or can't I just buy a set of house plans because it's too expensive to hire an architect? So we risk becoming irrelevant when the world actually, especially as we're gathering in great cities, the world needs great design more than ever. Not just for our cell phones and our cars, but for our buildings and our streets and our cities and so on. So I am a man on a mission. But in order to do great design, you have to know how to practice.
I was going to say, so do you think that, you're talking about the irrelevancy and some of these issues on the broadest scale of the entire profession, but it seems like a lot of the potential answers, they were worked out and they were lessons learned from HOK. So it's amazing to me, first, that Hellmuth, but also the other two founders would have this vision of seeing past the office. It's amazing that they had, again, especially Hellmuth, these principles and these ideas, very strong ideas, and then that they were basically able to do it is really astonishing, because for some context, as you said, it was founded in 1955, right? That's a completely different world from now.
Yes,
and the office has managed to kind of grow and maintain, which I want to talk about with you.
Yes.
But also for some context, HOK is a very large office. But I think a description to me that became clear, I don't know if you said it outright in the book, is that for those who know architecture and other offices, you guys were competitors with SOM in a lot of ways. But
Yes.
Culturally speaking, you were kind of the complete opposite.
Yes, we were.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think it's a true statement. And we have some former SOM people in the firm. Like, I'm sure the SOM has some former HOK people, but the comment that I have heard from SOM people is that inside their firms, they're highly competitive. That is, that one person will jockey for position to get the next assignment or the next promotion, and that they're not above climbing all over one another. And at HOK, it's just the opposite. We actually, and this is straight back due to the founders. You might call it a Midwest work ethic.
Right.
We're all going to cooperate. There's a sport analogy. Would you rather have an all-star team made up of, let's say, a basketball team or something, with every player is a star, but they don't play well together? Or would you rather have a team of very good players that absolutely practice playing well with each other as a team? I believe that architecture is a team sport, and that increasingly the complexities of design, because it's more complex than ever now, with all the new demands put on architects for green buildings and buildings that are safer and so on. We could talk all day about that. But yes, you need brilliance on the part of your designers, but you need a team to put together a proper building that's actually going to do more than just pass muster. That's actually going to be a really good building, an excellent building that will provide real value for the client and become a real a fixture of the community or the city in which it's located. So HOK taught that idea of teamwork. I didn't know it at the time. It just seemed like a big friendly place to me. People more senior than I, when I first joined, were only too happy to explain things to me, the rookie, and help me understand how things were. I do know and learned much later that the founders had a very simple idea about this. If somebody did something well, they got public praise at the Friday meeting of the office. If somebody did something that wasn't so good or that was the wrong direction, they were pulled into one of the founders' offices and talked to privately, not publicly berated, so that that sense of harmony was there. And it didn't take long for me to pick it up too, that, part of being an HOK person means that I have to help those around me. And if somebody needs some help, I should gladly give it. And you know what? Maybe they'll get the credit, maybe I'll get the credit. It doesn't matter. Over time, we're all going to succeed together. And that's a simple lesson, but a lot of firms don't have that.
No.
And I think that's one of the keys. And that's something that I mentioned in the book that began to erode as HOK grew explosively in the 60s and 70s and the 80s. And when I became CEO in 2003, there were parts and pieces of the firm that still collaborated well and treated each other like family, and other parts that did not. And the work to get everyone back on the same page took years, including dismissing a few people that said, this is my office, I'm going to do it my way. So that was actually the hardest part of reforming the firm after I became CEO. And again, it took the longest. Some of the operational and cash flow problems and so on took time also, but less time. We had a couple of probably the biggest dissent in the firm. I'll just tell you again openly about it. Was we had a very famous part of the firm called HOK Sport, and HOK Sport has designed most of the Major League Baseball and National Football League football stadiums, and a lot of the basketball and hockey arenas around the country and around the world now. But the guys that were in HOK Sport, which was an office dedicated to that sports architecture practice, didn't really start with HOK culture and never adopted it. And it was their way or the highway. And finally, even though they were highly successful, they weren't part of the firm. It was more like one of the sport franchises that's owned by somebody with a lot of money that says, well, I don't mind playing in this league as long as I get a chance to set some of the rules. Anyway, there was so much dissent. I finally made an arrangement with the leadership of the sport office to sell that practice to them on the condition that, they actually had to pay for it, but they mostly paid for it with their ownership of HOK stock. So It was almost cashless. And the rules were, they wanted to keep the HOK name, said, no, you can't do that unless you're part of HOK. They are now renamed or rebranded as Populous. Neither one, Populous was not allowed to practice any other kind of architecture for 5 years. HOK was not allowed to practice sports architecture for 5 years. And 5 years and 1 day later, we hired our first sports architects in London, actually. And then about 6 years later, we merged with 360 Architecture, another really fine sports design firm. And HOK is now back in the sports architecture business in a very large way.
Interesting.
And the difference is it's cultural. We've got a great bunch of sport designers, but they're collaborative, they're friendly. They want to share the work with the rest of us. So there's a lot more cross-office collaboration now between the new HOK Sport office and the rest of the firm. And that's the way we want it. So we're willing to go to great lengths to keep that culture intact.
Yeah.
If you have that, if you've got a good operation and you're well-led, which means well-led means also a good you have to be able to be consistently profitable, put some money aside for rainy days, then you're in a firm where you can reach for your dreams. And I think if you're just struggling and seeing if you can make payroll next week, you're not living your dream, you're just surviving.
Yeah.
So again, the book is about getting beyond that, having enough of a plan, enough of a strategy to build beyond just surviving to the point where you're actually making things happen and you're reaching out for the dreams of, well, what do we want to do next and how can we reach that pinnacle?
Yeah, and that's the pyramid. See, I learned something from the book. The pyramid. See, you have to read the book to know what the pyramid is. It's the secret to life.
It's in the book.
I would imagine, though, that's much more difficult to do. It's difficult to do, period. Okay. But perhaps it's in some ways like that would be easier to do if you started that way from day one. But, and I don't want to kind of skip over some important events, but you kind of, the pyramid, which was your plan to kind of fix a lot of the problems at HOK and make it more successful, that was created when the problems were already in place. So you not only had to do what made sense, first of all, but to retroactively fix, things that were already in place and had been running that way for actually some time.
That's right. Well, in fact, David, that's a great, if you'll just allow me, that's a great insight. And thank you for reading about the pyramid.
I like the pyramid.
There's a story behind it. Let me just tell you because I think people love stories, and the stories they're real.
Yep.
When I became CEO, before I was actually elected by the shareholders, we had a once a year shareholder meeting. One of the board members sent me a book about Lou Gerstner. And who is he? He was a man who was brought into IBM back when IBM was on the skids. And he helped to reinvent IBM. And the biggest struggle that he had wasn't figuring out what to do. He was getting everybody to collaborate in that direction, to be part of a team to make something happen. So I read that and I said, oh, well, we need to reform our operations. We need to strengthen our leadership, but we really need to behave as one big firm. And somebody else had said, well, you need to have a strategic plan, and strategic plans and I participated in development of a number of them that ended up to be big, thick books with comb bindings that you work really hard on by committee. You put it on the shelf and you forget about it, and you find it later with dust on the top.
Yeah.
And I said, well, no, I think I want a strategic plan that everybody can understand in an instant. And it's so simple that you can keep it in your head. So it's a pyramid. That's a very powerful symbol. It's also an architectural symbol, one of the earliest building types. And as everybody knows, pyramids are built from the base. You don't start at the top, you start at the bottom, and you build to the top. And so I put 4 steps in a pyramid, each one of which depended on the step below for its success. So strong board is at the bottom. That basically means unified leadership. We're on a journey now to reform our firm. And if the board isn't together on it, the leadership of the firm, including my executive committee, who are also members of the board, if we're not all unified around this idea of where we're going, we won't get there. And in fact, we ended up replacing some board members who were not part of that. So there was work to do at each level. Once we had the strong board in place and where people were unified about our mission, then reforming our operations was the next level. Great operations meant knowing how to measure whether you're a success or a failure as an office financially. Most people, because we have accountants that talk in an accountant's language, not an architect language, most people don't know when they find they're not making money, they don't know why they're not making money every month or every year. And what's your biggest expense? People.
Yeah.
People. It's not the paper clips or the office supplies or the office rent or the computers. It's people. Well, how many people can I afford? I dug into the numbers and found out that dug into the numbers with my CFO and my controller, and probably spent 3 days digging through numbers and discovered something very simple. If you take all the people in your office, from the leadership in an office to the draftsmen, the designers, the CAD operators, the BIM operators, the person that makes the coffee, everybody. If you add up all their salaries, forget the fringe benefits and all that stuff, just salaries, because people know what their salaries are. They might not know the total of all their benefits, just salaries. If you're making $1 million a year in fees, you can afford to pay about $500,000 in salaries. Very simple, 50% rule. So if you're making $1 million in fees and you have a $600,000 payroll, you're underwater.
Mm-hmm.
And we had never looked at in that simple way before, at a simple way to determine if we had too many people or not enough people. And that was a revelation. It was also quite difficult because when people realized they had too many people, what did they do?
Right.
Well, because we were a multiple office firm, their first instinct was to hustle and market and get more work. Well, that's good. That if you can learn, if you can raise your fees so that your salaries then become 50% of fees, you're in good shape. But it caused collaboration. Hey, I've got 3 too many people. I'm in San Francisco. Maybe LA and HOK LA can use 3 people for the next 3 months. Maybe somebody in Dallas can use them. Maybe somebody in Hong Kong can use them. So we began to, it was keeping an office running lean, but also an incentive to collaborate, which is part of HOK culture. Mm-hmm. So everything began to work toward a common purpose of thinking about the whole firm, not just my office and your office.
Yeah.
So anyway, I came up with metrics for how many people you should have. How about backlog? Work in the pipeline. Learned something, dug through a bunch of numbers, same idea. Found that if I was earning $100,000 a month in fees, and I had a backlog of $1 million, that's 10 months worth of backlog. Mm-hmm. If I had 10 months of backlog, I wasn't growing or shrinking, I was steady. If I had less than $1 million in the backlog, or less than 10 months, I was shrinking. I might not know it yet, but I'm shrinking. If I had $1.5 million in the backlog, I'm growing. So I can plan. Oh, if I'm growing in the next 10 months, I need to bring in more people or maybe transfer people from another office. If I'm shrinking, I need to get more work and I need to think about shifting some of my employees to another office for a while. And then finally about collections. This is and again, architects are not accountants and shouldn't be, but simple ideas.
Yeah.
Cash flow. We earn money by billing clients and collecting fees. And when we earn money from a client, we fill out timesheets or do something. And at the end of the week, we say, this week we earned $1,000 from client Jones. And that's great. Now let's go next week and we'll earn another 1,000. Well, at the end of the month, we better bill Jones for $1,000 or $2,000, whatever it is, and then we better collect it. Because if we say we earned it, that's called an accrual earning. That means that's an estimate. I believe I've earned that, but it's not really earned until the client pays us. The difference between accrual and cash is profound, and many architects get trapped by accruing of a lot of income and not collecting it fast enough or maybe ever if clients run out of an ability to pay. So my controller was a smart man. He had a plaque on his desk that said, accrual is an opinion. And underneath that it said, cash is a fact.
Yeah.
So the 90-day rule was to turn accrual into cash. We said to an office, we'll allow you to accrue this earnings on your books, $1,000 from client Jones, and we'll give you 90 full days, which is generous actually. It's now been downward shifted to 60 days. Mm-hmm. We'll give you 90 days to collect it. And if you don't collect it in 90 days, we're going to unearn it, which means it's going to be taken off your books as earnings. So that we move to get cash and accrual accounting closer together. And that also had a profound effect. And yes, there was plenty of squawking and complaining that we were being too hard on people. But people got over it.
Yeah.
People got over it.
Yeah.
So good operations, strong boards and good operations. The third step of the pyramid took the longest, which was true collaboration or reestablishing HOK culture. And I would say that probably took all around the world. We did it with a variety of ways, which I'll describe briefly, to get people to treat each other like family, like that office in St. Louis that I joined so many years before. How do you build that kind of a culture in a firm? Well, first you communicate and you communicate some more. I travel to every single office twice a year and gave talks. And I would talk to the leaders, but then my most favorite was to talk to the staff. And I would take several hours in Ask Me Anything sessions. And if an office was well run and people were vigorously working together, I got peppered with questions. Well-run offices have a buzz. If offices were not well-run, if they were more managed than led, and people were hunkered down, maybe they were afraid they were going to be laid off or something, I would stand there and say, okay, now after talking about the state of the firm, what are your questions? And nothing. I remember once in Canada, in Toronto, I did an office meeting, asked for a question, nobody. I asked again, nobody. They were afraid. They were afraid. So finally I pulled out a coin, a Canadian $1 coin has got a loon on the side of it. It's a water bird. And they call it a loonie. So I said, here's a loonie. I'll give a loonie to the first person that asks me a question. So I bribed him. And finally, a young lady raised her hand and gave me a little milquetoast question. And I thanked her profusely and gave her the loonie. Finally, and I said, okay, who else? The young man put his hand up. He said, if I ask a question, will I get a loonie? No, the loonies are over. Now you can get that question. But actually, it was like the dam burst.
Right.
Pretty soon, the questions got more emboldened. And when I said I'll answer anything, I meant it, up to and including the finances of the firm were quite transparent inside.
Really?
Everybody can know what the books look like, how we're doing financially, and the state of the firm, the state of each office in the firm. It's all open book. The only thing I won't talk about, or never did, was something that was personal. If they wanted to talk about an individual, let's say, that was struggling or in trouble, I wouldn't talk about that. But the firm, yes. Clients, yes. Projects, yes. Individual offices or groups, yes. So talking with people and giving them the idea that we were one family was an important part of it. We also had firm-wide retreats. We couldn't bring 2,000 people together, but we brought several hundred together a couple of times in retreats. One memorable one in Cancun, Mexico, to a resort hotel. And the first day was the most memorable because we left this really nice plush hotel, went up into the hills, the mountains behind Cancun, to a very poor village, and in the hot sun with humidity of 100%, worked all day on a kindergarten school, fixing it up, painting, landscaping, actually put up a new small building for the kindergartners. They were all watching us behind a fence. And at lunch, the mothers came and gave us lunch. We ate with some of the fathers who were helping us. At the end of the day, the gates were open and the kindergartners rushed into that schoolyard to play with the new play equipment. And learning to work together, getting our hands dirty together, working up a sweat together was incalculable. Oh, we're one team and we're all kind of alike. We're all equally dirty. We're all equally tired, but we're all equally happy about what we did together. So public service, and then 2 more days of work together. So those were memorable and they were helpful. Technology glued us together. All one technology, simple things like we're all going to use the same software and hardware. We're going to have an intranet or an internal website, and everybody's photograph is going to be in there so you can see, instead of just a name on a roster, you can see a face. And then we began to add, where did you go to school? What was your last project? What office are you in? Are you registered? So you could get to know people. And we spent a lot of money on very high-end video conference rooms, which we called advanced collaboration rooms, because we wanted offices to work on projects together. And advanced collaboration rooms use very, very large screen, high def. Probably the screens are, 6 feet wide, 4 feet high or 5 feet high. You sit at a desk or at a long conference table, and people in another office sit at their conference table. It's almost basically full size. People looking and talking, high quality sound, and a screen on one or the other side with the data that we're talking about, the drawing of the model or the whatever it is. So each office has one of those. So without actually flying around, people could sit in a meeting with each other and get to know each other. The images are big enough that you can read body language and look people in the eye and see if they're smiling or grimacing and so on. The last thing we did that actually turned the trick was we changed our bonus system. And the bonus system at HOK was originally, originally it was the founder's discretion. But as the firm grew, the bonus system became formulaic. If you contributed 10% of the profit to the firm, you get 10% of the bonus, that kind of thing. And that only works well if the culture is intact and if everybody is making a profit. But if some offices were profitable and some were not, then then it starts a rush to, well, I want to get this fee so that I can get this profit and get my bonus. And that may mean I'm not going to be too concerned about my fellow office that doesn't have the work, and maybe I should share with them.
Sure.
So we changed the bonus system for the leaders only. And the leaders were put in their own pool, about 200 people. And they were reviewed by the executive committee, a group of 5 to 6, I think there's 7 ex-com members now. And in addition to profit, we also reviewed them and set their bonus based on collaboration. Were they actually collaborating with each other, or were they selfish with their work and so on? And on design quality, and on how green their work is. We've got a whole strategy for being the greenest firm in the country or in the world in terms of zero net energy, zero net carbon buildings. And we're serious about it. So anyway, those were the criteria and more that we began to leaven just how much money did you make. And once we did that, and the leaders began to understand that, oh, my bonus isn't based just on how much money I can make, but it's based on these other, let's say, softer values, everything changed. And yes, during that process, some people had to go. That was always the most difficult part of it. But if you're not on our team, then you don't belong in the firm. You're not part of our culture.
Right.
So that process, true collaboration, took the longest. It's 5 to 7 years total. Dreams is the top of the pyramid. And if you do the first 3 levels and you have the firm working well led with true collaboration, then you can reach for your dreams. And there are lots of them, and everybody has their own. In the firm, it's just not my dream. My dream was to get the firm working well together. So I already reached my pinnacle. Other people we want to be the greenest design firm in the world.
Right.
We want to design the best, most integrated building in terms of integration between the architect and the contractor. And I think we did that. King Abdulaziz University of Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia. Just briefly describe it. $5 billion project from scratch, brand new university. King Abdullah, who's now passed away, wanted this university to be the premier university in Saudi Arabia, the first university which was co-ed and staffed almost exclusively with professors from outside of the kingdom. He wanted to be the window to the West. And he wanted it to be built. He was an old man, and he was in a hurry because he didn't know how much longer he would live. He went to the Saudi Ministry of Education and said, how long will it take for you to design and build a new university for science and technology? 10 years. He said, that's too long. I won't live that long. He went to Aramco. Saudi Aramco is the Saudi oil and gas company. That's a nationalized oil and gas company. Aramco knows how to build things.
Hmm.
They know how to drill for oil and build pipelines and oil refineries, all the rest. They said, how about you? How fast can you move? 36 months. So we were called in. We were called in by Aramco, and some of our people went to London for a meeting with Aramco. And they said, well, we want you to design this university and a town of 20,000 people to support the university, all from scratch. And you have 36 months. 36 months, that's not too bad for designing all that. No, you don't understand. From today, when we're here in London, till when we open the doors, we went 36 months, design and construction.
No way.
And so we said yes. We said yes. It was a hugely challenging project. Everything was fast-tracked, everything. They were grading the site and drilling a well for water before we got on the plane to go back to our offices. That project, we used full use of BIM. We used the MacLeamy curve, which is that you cram the biggest effort of your work into the design phase, and you double check and triple check everything, because once it goes out the door to the contractor, it's going to get built. They were pouring the foundations when we were still working on the buildings. That project was finished from the beginning of design until the end of construction, 34 months.
Wow.
34 months.
Wow.
We ended up with 900 HOK people working on it from 10 different offices.
Wow.
All collaborative work.
Yeah.
All on the computer using our advanced collaboration rooms. We even gave the client an advanced collaboration room so we could have face-to-face meetings anytime we wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And we made maximum use of all the BIM tools and all the analysis tools that have sprung up that help architects and engineers understand as we're designing something, does this actually meet my goals for greenness? Does it meet the client's brief for area and cost and so on? We're very proud of that project. It achieved a LEED Platinum rating.
Wow.
That single project added more square footage of LEED Platinum than all the square footage of LEED Platinum projects that had been built prior to that time. So it was a huge accomplishment, a perfect example of true collaboration and leveraging technology. So it was a dream in itself.
That's incredible. That's incredible. It's interesting. Something I learned from the book too was that you have a very good sense of like the more analytical changes or mathematical changes that need to happen, right? Looking back at the numbers, doing those calcs,
Yep.
but also how to create situations to more in a positive way motivate people to do something.
Yes.
And if I might be misremembering, but there was like an example of, I think there was a situation where you needed like leadership to attend a certain kind of meeting, and sometimes people wouldn't show up. So you just made like basically an attendance sheet
Yes.
pinned up on the wall, and then suddenly becomes like a game. It's almost like you set up these games. And in that case, it became a game of like, well, I don't want to be the only person that doesn't have a check mark next to my name, so I'm going to be there.
Yes, David, you have it just about right. It's very simple. We instituted, normally a board of directors, our board of directors would meet once a year or maybe every 6 months in person. And I said, well, we close our books every month. Let's have monthly board meetings that are virtual. And it's important enough so that every month we know where we are and the board knows. And we expanded the board to there was somebody from every big office and every big practice group, which is aviation and sports and healthcare and science and technology, so on. And so about 30 people on the board, and they were virtual and are using our advanced collaboration rooms. And the meetings were supposed to start at 8 o'clock in the morning in the West Coast, and people would kind of dribble and drab in. And finally, I said, okay, we're going to start exactly on the hour, and I'm going to start taking attendance. And I did a little Excel attendance sheet, all the names on the left for you, and little squares for each month, January, February, March, so on. And if you were there when I called your name, you got a green fill in your square. If you were absent, your square was white. And if you were late, you got light green. And I never said I was going to do this or anything. I just started doing it. And the next month, when people came to the board meeting, they saw, well, their square was white, and they got really concerned about it. Well, I was at a client meeting. I couldn't make it. Well, okay, I understand, but you were absent. So then people started to show up on time. And people didn't want to have a white square, and they didn't want to have a light green. They wanted a dark green square across the board. And I never made a big fuss about it. I just did it. But people seized upon it as a graphical. Again, it was graphical, like the pyramid.
Yep.
Simple idea that, I want all those green squares to be filled in behind my name because it means I'm really a solid board member and I attend and I'm there on time. But it was a lesson for everybody of, if we say we're going to start the meeting at 8 o'clock, we're going to start at 8, not at 8:10. And it did have a positive effect. And again, it was a funny thing because I never made a big thing about it. I just started doing it. And people got the idea for themselves. But it was a lot of fun. And it did contribute to much greater and much more on-time attendance at board meetings.
But it's so fascinating because the kind of the more philosophical lessons in there, I think, apply to a lot of the things you've done. There's, as you say, like making complex things simple, having a graphic that's also simple. And again, this tied to how people, almost emotionally, viscerally respond to the thing.
Yes.
I think it's very fascinating. I want to talk about the expansion of the office, though, because I think the expansion ties together, obviously, issues that happened in the office later on in its life, and also the positives of how it started. And it seems like, George Hellmuth, one of the founders, I kind of got the feeling that he almost single-handedly brought in the majority of the work for HOK.
Yes.
Which is a testament to his character, right, and his skill. And it seems like all the three partners are very conscious of imparting their specific knowledge and the culture to the people they brought on in their St. Louis office. But that's a different, that works when you're in one place, obviously. Yeah. When you start to expand and open offices either by a satellite office from a project or acquiring other offices, which is like another level removed, that game of that really personal connection as being the glue that holds everything together, it starts to kind of not work so well in some instances, right?
You said it. Yes, it was much easier when it was just one office, much easier. And it was in scale meaning that one man, George Hellmuth, could more or less market and keep everybody fed, keep the work coming. As the office grew, when I joined 12 years after HOK was founded, HOK St. Louis had grown to 150 people, which was quite large, but it was still one office. And Hellmuth by then had gotten a couple of assistants who he was grooming to, in fact, they were calling on clients just as he was, trained by him. Mm-hmm. Then, as I went to San Francisco, again, the firm, and Gio Obata was still designing everything. He had designed teams, but he was the master. He would go around to each team and look at the work and make corrections or set new directions or so on. But finally, HOK got to be out of scale for the three founders when the other offices began to be formed. San Francisco was easy because they sent some St. Louis people like myself there. So it was just another St. Louis transplant to a new location. There's an advantage to that in that you keep the culture intact. Disadvantage is we were babes in the woods in San Francisco. We didn't know anything about how to get work. or how to build a practice in the West Coast. So that was a disadvantage. The firm bought an office, bought Kahn & Jacobs in New York City. The advantage was that Kahn & Jacobs was well established. The disadvantage was it was a firm with a completely different culture. And it turned out to be more or less a disaster. Kahn & Jacobs people, Bob Jacobs, the sole remaining founder, wanted to retire. Typical story. He needed the money to retire. The firm had not created the money for him to retire, so he had to sell. HOK bought it. Bob Jacobs retired. The people in his office didn't want to be part of HOK. Those country bumpkins from St. Louis. And that actually was a struggle. We sent people there from St. Louis to help market and so on. They were almost persona non grata in the office. But that all finally, we finally had to take stronger medicine. They hadn't even taken the Kahn & Jacobs sign off the door. So Gio Obata finally got fed up with it. He went to the office and he fired two of the kind of ringleaders of the resistance, took the sign off the door, and a couple of weeks later moved the office to a new location, right. Rockefeller Center, with an HOK name on the door, and things began to get better. But that office struggled with culture, with adopting HOK culture for years. And it's finally turned the trick now. It's a fantastic office now. But it was a years in the making because we started poorly. It's a little bit like, again, designing a firm, designing a building. If you start out designing a building the wrong way and make some fundamental errors, you will pay for it during design development, working drawings, and you'll pay for it big time in construction. And the client will have a building that will never be optimal after the construction is finished, painful. So getting it right the first time applies to designing a building and designing a firm. The partners, the original founders, had big debates about what's the best way to expand. Get a project in another city and open up a project office and put somebody there to market for more work, buy a firm in another office in another city, or just send somebody to a new city and start. And HOK has tried it all, made plenty of mistakes. But I would say, hands down, buying another firm is the most challenging because of culture. It can work, and it succeeded beautifully with 360 architecture that's now become HOK Sport, because we were so careful to make sure that the culture, how the firm felt on the inside, was so much more like HOK instead of like being on the planet Mars or something. So most of HOK's growth has been based on taking advantage of a project in a new location.
I see.
But not all. There have been some purchases as well.
I kind of have to ask, like, you would think that the people who are going to be acquired, obviously they're interested in it. They gain something, I would assume, financial out of it, reputation, but also, like, when they meet the HOK leadership, they must have a sense of what you guys are about. And since HOK seems to be so self-aware that culture is a big part of them, I would imagine that that's part of the conversation. But I guess people just sign on saying like, well, let's not really worry about that part.
Well, I'll just tell you a little story, and it's in the book. When we learned that 360 was perhaps up for sale, that's the sports design firm in Kansas City, I rang up, so we learned about it, and I rang up the leadership of the firm, and I said, I introduced myself, I'd never met them, and said, I understand that you might be interested in having a conversation about, and we didn't say being acquired, but I said a merger. And it's
right.
The subtlety, but we're really talking about not having somebody just get swallowed up, but merging the best of what they are with the best of what HOK is. And it has to be not just words, but it has to be sincerely meant and felt and acted on. And so his question was, he and I finally met in person. Turns out they had a little branch office in San Francisco to do West Coast work. So we were only a few blocks apart. We met Brad Schrock, really nice man, one of the founders of 360. And Brad said, well, how much will you pay for us? And I said, well, Brad, we'll have to get to that, but that's actually a fairly mathematical exercise. We look at what you've got in your backlog, and we look at your cash flow and things like that, and we'll make a determination. But that's the easy part. The more difficult one is, how are you set up to operate? What kind of computer system do you have? Are you users of BIM? What software do you use? What's your process for doing your accounting and the operational things? And I said, and actually the biggest one of all, which we're most concerned about, isn't the price. We can fix on a price. It isn't the operations if they're not too much different, because we can fix that. It's culture. We want to know how you feel about each other inside your office. What are your values? What are your goals as a firm? And so we spent more time working on exploring and understanding each other's culture than we did on the other two combined. We had meetings in each other's offices. We had meetings off site. And we learned something that was really interesting. The two founders, George Heinlein and Brad Schrock, were not yet ready to step down. They didn't want to just take the money and go. They said, we have a group of second-tier leaders, people that they brought in and brought up, and said, we've grown, but we haven't grown fast enough for these second-tier leaders to all become leaders in our future. And that bothers us. We need to grow faster. So we need a bigger platform. And HOK is ideal for us because you're everywhere. And using the HOK platform, we think we can get sports work not only in different U.S. states, but around the world. And that was the key to us, that they said, we have some good young people that are coming up in our firm, and we just don't have enough room to bring them all along unless we grow faster. And so we met those young people. And in fact, now one of them that was running their little San Francisco office is running HOK San Francisco, which is an office of 250 people. He's that good. So it was just a good fit. But that's the key to it. The money was relatively easy. Operations, there were a few bumps. We had to change some computer systems and a few processes, but the culture is everything.
You know, one of the lines in the book that stood out to me is the idea of suggest, don't tell, right? Which is to, well, maybe perhaps you can explain it, but it's meaning to say, if you're in a conversation, you need to tell someone to do something. You don't say, I demand you to do this, employee, right, at the extreme. You suggest it, and it's up to them to understand, like, they're being polite, and I should follow what they're saying because they're in charge.
Yes, it's subtle, but it's, yes. When I started in St. Louis, I found the founders were all three there. I knew them all well. I worked for Gio, the design leader at that time, but got to know George Hellmuth really well and George Cassavam really well. I never heard them raise their voice. I never heard them shout at somebody. They were always, and I never heard them say, well, tomorrow we're all going to do it this way. I just heard them say, well, we think it's best if we do it like this. And it was conversational. It wasn't demand. And when I was there at an office meeting or something, or just hearing one of them talk, my colleagues that have been around HOK longer just took it really seriously. And without actually thinking about it too much, I began to understand, because of how the other people around me reacted. Oh, the way this firm works is people don't raise their voice and shout or shout orders. They just say it quietly. You have to listen. But once you hear it, that's it. That's the way it is. And I suppose if somebody in St. Louis had not understood and had continued to do something differently, he or she would have been called into one of their offices and quietly talked to, now George or Joetta or whoever, this is what we really mean when we say this. I never got one of those talks, but it was simple, it was clear, and it was calm. When we began to, when I came to San Francisco, we just brought that with us.
Right.
And the people that led the firm in San Francisco all just got it, and new employees that came in pretty soon got, we call it being vaccinated with the HOK culture. And but the other offices, like in New York, oh my God.
New York is a little bit of we lived in New York for 7 years, so it's not quite the same as San Francisco.
Yeah.
The context is a little more aggressive.
And people would say, well, why should I?
Yeah.
You can't make me.
Yeah.
Or that's a stupid idea or something. And so so the idea of harmony, teamwork, collaboration needs to be learned and needs to be inculcated into the culture of an office. And I think of all the lessons that I learned, that third step in the pyramid of true collaboration is if you don't have that teamwork idea, you're not going to have much of a firm. You might have some individual, you might have a star designer, you might have a really great business strategy or some other whiz-bang way to make some money, but your firm is not going to feel like a great big family, a great big team. And the chances of carrying on beyond the founders, I think, is diminished. Most firms, and just think about this, you're both young, but people that have been around, the firms that were big time firms when I graduated from college are mostly gone. There are some that are around. SOM stands to mind, but another one was CRS, Caudell, Rowlett, and Scott, Houston. And when I was a young architect, I admired three firms very much when I was at HOK. I admired HOK for our culture and our ability to design anything, that diversity idea. I admired SOM for being the button-down shirt collar, three-piece striped suit polish of designing, especially, many American modern cities wouldn't be the same without SOM buildings sticking up in the center someplace. And I admired CRS as the thinking person's firm. CRS actually patented a system called problem seeking. Sounds a bit like my run toward trouble, but when they got a new project, they had a whole system perfected and patented for how they would go to a client's office and get in a conference room for a week and drill down into the client's thinking and feeling about whatever their project was, fill up the wall with snow cards on pins and a certain system of colors and so on that allowed them to thoroughly understand what the client is, the most active listening. So I really admired them for that. We ended up having an opportunity to buy that firm because they made a mistake. And that's another little story that I will tell you. CRS was a real innovator. And one of the ways they innovated was to raise money instead of earning, how do you, if you're a firm and you need to have some money in the bank, how do you get it? Well, the old fashioned and the longest way is you earn it and you don't spend it all, you put some of it in the bank. The second way is you borrow it from a bank or from maybe an investor. And that money has strings attached. You have to pay it back someday and you have to pay interest or there's some burden with that money. It's not yours. It's just temporarily yours. The third way is to go public and sell a piece of your firm to investors. That's what they did at CRS. They got themselves listed on the American Stock Exchange. And there was a lot of interest because they were innovative and it changed the firm. People began expecting quarterly profits and growth and dividends. And so the people in charge of CRS began to invest in non-design work. First, they bought Serene and Company, which is industrial design, so it became CRSS. And then the Serene side of the business somebody figured out that there was money to be made in designing and building gas-fired power plants for peak power load. In Texas in particular, on hot days when the regular power grid was struggling to keep up with demand, but people were turning on their air conditioners, you could get people to pay, the power companies would pay you a lot of money if you had a gas-fired power plant sitting ready to add to the grid. And they made a lot of money. They became a power plant company. And the little CRS design group that was still part of them didn't fit. I think of it a little bit like you raise your children and then your grandchildren sell you into slavery. The original design group was no longer wanted. And so CRSS, the public company that was a power plant company, offered to sell us, HOK, the CRS group. So we went down to Houston and met them and so on. And great bunch of people, a lot like HOK people culturally. Some really talented people. And then we met the CRSS person. He was anxious to get rid of CRS, didn't see the value. And we made an arrangement for a purchase price in 20 minutes.
Wow.
The people from CRS, design group, couldn't have been more grateful. They said, you rescued us from a firm where we no longer fit. They became HOK Houston. And today, HOK Houston is one of our most successful offices. The leader of that office is now on the executive committee of HOK. He's the chief operating officer of the firm. That was a case where the thinking man's firm, what I thought of when I was a young man, lost its way. And the only way to get themselves back was to get another firm like HOK. And fortunately, it was us to make them part of us. And so they got a chance to be designers again and live in the culture of people who love and believe in great design.
Gosh, there's so many ways that an architecture business can go wrong, or be limited, or be capped. I mean, and I think that also goes back to the fact that there were three founders and they each had a different role. And even though Castlebaum's position ended up being split into two because he was kind of doing production and also managing, but still the fact that there were the three legs to the stool, that mentality seemed to have carried through. I want to ask a more kind of bizarre question, which is the office culture, which is, I think, described by the suggest don't tell, also described by the kind of design philosophy of being a really good listener to the client, right? And this way of communicating, it feels very much tied to kind of the Midwestern, I don't know, aura, and almost kind of whatever that means. And I'm almost wondering, like, do you sense that it's tied to that? And if like, can you be convincing in this manner? If you're a fast-paced speaking kid from New Jersey, like this, do you know what I mean? Like, how do those two worlds kind of clash?
Yes. Well, let me just say, of the three founders, the designer was Gio Obata, and he was not from the Midwest. He was born in San Francisco, raised in Berkeley.
Mm-hmm.
His father and his mother were immigrants from Japan. Gio was a Nisei, which is a firstborn of Japanese parentage, firstborn in the U.S. His father taught painting at Cal, and his work is still exhibited around the country. And his mother brought the art of ikebana, which is flower arranging, to the west coast of the U.S. from Japan. So Gio grew up in a family that was steeped in the arts, and this is a long heritage. The Obata family from Sendai in Japan, long line of artisans. And so Gio enrolled in college at Cal, at Berkeley, in September 1941, but he was more interested in architecture than in art, even though he's still, to this day, a very artistic man. So he enrolled in architecture school in September 1941. In December, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor that started World War II for the U.S. And after a few months, the country did a very bad thing, which was to round up all the Japanese Americans on the three western states, Washington, Oregon, and California, and put them in detention camps. There was a provision in that law that allowed young Gio to continue his education, but he had to leave California. He wasn't allowed to stay there. And he those days, no internet, no phones were almost impossible in those days to make long distance calls. So telegraphs and letter writing, he applied to all the Midwestern schools, the Big Ten, including my alma mater, Illinois, and was turned down because because of his, he was Japanese American, the feelings were running very high at the beginning of the war. Little Washington University in St. Louis gave him a telegram that said, yes, we accept your application, please come join us. He got that telegram the day before he was to be shipped off to the detention camp with his parents and his sister. And even so, it was touch and go. When he was on his way to the train to take his trip back to St. Louis, the train in Oakland, he was stopped by the police. And they said, you should be in camp where it shows your paperwork. He showed them his college acceptance, and they let him go. If it had come one day later, he would have been in the camps. So Gio came from the West, came from a different family, different culture. His culture was West Coast and Japanese, not Midwestern. So think about this. A young man, his family had just been shut away, came to a new city, didn't know anybody. Washington University, the faculty and the students adopted him. So did the city of St. Louis. He lives there to this day, but he could live anywhere he wanted. He actually came back out to West Coast and built a house, didn't find that he was comfortable, moved back to St. Louis. He lives there still. So Gio is not Midwestern, but he is, and I think because of his experience of being seared like this as a youngster, and then after the war was over, after he graduated from Washington U, he got drafted. And he served for, I think, a period of 9 months or something in the Aleutian Islands in the U.S. Army. And this was after the war, so there was no wartime. But think about that. A young man that had all this trauma during World War II, then having this happen, he didn't complain. He never complained. He just took it in, but he became, I think, probably the most determined man I've ever met in my life. A perfect choice for George Hellmuth to make. Hellmuth had a brilliant idea about a strategy, but he also had a great eye for talent. He picked Minoru Yamasaki as his first partner in Smith Hinchman and Grill's days. And Yama is the one that went on to design World Trade Center much later. Then he picked Gio Obata to be his partner when he and Yama decided to split the firm. So Gio would never give up. And instead of, most architects, I'm embarrassed to say this, when they go to a client to present themselves, what do they talk about? They talk about their work themselves.
Yeah.
I've done this. Here's a picture of that building. Isn't this a pretty one? I did this. Aren't I great? And Gio would say, you have to, and he had this way of saying it, you have to really, and then he would pause. When he paused, you have to really, and he kind of cock his head, and you have to really listen to what your clients have to say, and they'll tell you insights about the design work that you need to do. So he did it just the opposite of, I think, the traditional architect approach. It's about the client. Hellmuth was the same way. Hellmuth said, you have to be sincerely interested in the client. The client is not just a job. The client is a human being, a person. Ideally, they're your friend. If they're your friend, you'll get the work, but you might get more work. But you have to become friends. Gio's idea was you have to really listen. The best designers at HOK have always been those who really do pay attention to clients. So I don't know that that's Midwestern. I think it's just a really sensible way to think about things, to approach things. Is, the client wants me to design something. Maybe I should listen to what the client has in mind. And so Gio often won work just by his listening demeanor in an interview, by not saying too much, just by listening, maybe asking a few questions of the client. What do you mean by this? And what's your idea about that? I've watched him do it so many times, but I never heard Gio never complain about the war years or being drafted or any of that. It was always, and what's the most important thing? The next client, the next job. Always looking forward, never looking back. No bitterness.
That is an incredible human being. And all three of the partners, from what I remember, they continued to be involved with the office even after, this gets technical, but at the age of 65, right, they have to sell back their stock to the company for future leadership. But all of them, reached that point where like, what are you talking about? I'm still young. I got a lot of time left. I got a lot of things to do. Yeah,
Hellmuth worked, I think, another 10 years after he sold his stock back. Wow. And George Castlebaum, unfortunately died at age 62, I believe it was, of a cerebral hemorrhage. It was quite a blow and came at a difficult, challenging time that the firm recovered from, but it was a foretaste of the challenges to come. Gio Obata retired at age 70, or sold his stock back, I should say. Did not retire. Made an arrangement with his successor and my predecessor, Jerry Sinkoff, to have a 1-year consulting contract with HOK. So for 1 year, he came in and worked just like he did before, served clients, designed buildings. At the end of the year, he said, I'm still not really ready to It was renewed a year. It was renewed 24 times, 24 years. So he worked until he was 94. He really doesn't come in anymore, but if he does, he's always welcome if there's a place for him. He's now in failing health, but he's 96 years old.
Yeah, it's true. So, it's impressive to get to that age regardless of what you're doing.
Regardless. Just an extraordinary man. He not only was a great architect, great designer, and a great leader, but he was also, learned this from his father. He's a meticulous gardener. So he did a lot of gardening at his home. He was always interested in and seemed to collect friends from around the world that are in the art field. He went to Cranbrook Academy and got to know the Eliel and Errol Saarinen, that Errol's father, that started the academy. And there he met all kinds of luminaries. So he knew people and still does, probably has outlived most of them by now. But when he was a kid, his father used to go to Yosemite Valley to paint. And his father became best friends with Ansel Adams, the famous photographer that did most of his photography in the Sierras and in Yosemite. And Gio can remember his father and Ansel Adams having a drink at night, talking about design.
Jeez.
A photographer and a painter.
Wow.
So what a childhood. I mean, George Castlebaum, on the other hand, he was Midwestern, but from Kansas, only child. He's kind of a straight arrow guy. When he got to be, he was a young man, a boy, and he walked by a church every day on his way to school in Kansas. Thought it was the most beautiful building he'd ever seen, and decided, I want to be an architect and do beautiful buildings. Never wavered, never changed. When he got to be college age, his mother, who was very involved in his life, decided that they looked through colleges and picked Washington University in St. Louis because it was good school, good reputation, and not too far from Kansas. So George went to St. Louis, to Washington U, and never went back to Kansas, never left St. Louis, but became president of the AIA, was involved in all kinds of civic things in the city of St. Louis. George believed that architects should not, he said, do not withdraw. Don't just hunker down in your drafting room and close off the world. Architects, there's too many important decisions being made out there before the architect gets involved.
Mm-hmm.
And if the architect is involved with his or her city, university, community, professional group, you can have an outsized influence. So he always, he was a super organized man. So not only really wore two hats at HOK, management and production, but was always involved outside the firm as well, right up until his last day. Great, all extraordinary men.
The book is fascinating because you clearly did a whole lot of work to better understand everyone's history and, their lineage and things like this. But also you weave into it quite effortlessly your own story. And one specific question I had was that, so I'm reading the book and it's all going along. And then you get sent to what you call charm school. And it's fascinating to me. I think it's a great name that you gave it, but also, to that point, the issues that you were bringing up in the book and you saw in The Office, from the reader's perspective, at least from my perspective, I'm like, that makes sense. What you're saying, like we should probably address those issues.
Yeah.
So maybe could you quickly tell us what charm school was?
Yes.
But also, do you think looking back that you were in fact bullheaded at that time, or like, was there a change for you, or do you look back and you were like, no, I
think I have. I certainly hope that I've learned a few things along the way. I tended to be impatient. If I knew the answer to some direction we should take or something, I was impatient with others. There's no doubt about that. So I think charm school definitely helped, let's say, sand down some of the edges. And
right.
The funny thing about charm school, I'll just tell a little story if you've read it in the book. As I was approached by the HR director. I was at that time, I think, the COO of HOK. And he took me to a nice dinner in St. Louis. I was out in San Francisco, flew to St. Louis, had a nice dinner at an Italian restaurant, got us a good bottle of red wine. And he said, Patrick, the leaders of the firm think that you could be the next CEO, but you need to learn patience with people. And so what I'd like to suggest is that you get some executive coaching, and I will pick out an executive coach in San Francisco, so it's convenient for you. And I said, oh, you mean charm school? And I meant it because I think this is really very practical stuff. If you know the answer, if you think you know the answer, and you just tell somebody else, the first reaction of somebody else is, well, what do you know? Why should I?
Yep.
You have to bring people along. You can't just say this or that, because you can become a manager instead of a leader, or maybe a dictator instead of a leader. The difference between leading and managing is basically your regard for the people. If you bring people along and treat them with respect, take the time to explain things, why something is important, listen to their questions about it, be patient enough and answer the questions, then people say, oh, that does sound like a good idea. Let's do it that way. Almost, in fact, if you do it properly or the best way, it's no longer your idea, it's theirs. So I called it charm school. But the funny thing about charm school was this man, this coach gave me a battery of tests to take. You fill out a Briggs Stratton, or I've forgotten the name of it now, but it ended up that all of my points were over in one side of this chart. And it said, these are the characteristics of people that have this chart reading. And there were a series of synonyms, words that describe this person, and one of them was bullheaded. So that really bit me and struck me. So
I'm not bullheaded. You're bullheaded.
I'm not bullheaded. So I drove home and intending to ask, and at the bottom of the chart it said, if you don't think so, ask a friend or a family member. Okay, I'll do that.
It knew already that you didn't think you were bullheaded.
I don't know.
Yeah.
And so I drove home and went in the front door, and the first person I saw was my daughter, our daughter. And I think she was maybe 9 years old or 10 years old. And I said, Elizabeth, do you think I'm bullheaded? And Elizabeth, who's pretty sharp, said, why, no, Daddy, I think you're bald-headed, which is quite true. So she was quite nimble and shifted it off. But later I had a chat with my wife, who, of course, I met at HOK, and in a very, very, very sweet way, let me know that, well, maybe I could use a little softening. And so I did the charm school. I continue to call it that because I think that's what it was. I did it in earnest. And the basic thing that I learned was take your time. If you have the right answer, maybe you do, maybe you don't, but it won't do you any good to have the right answer unless other people adopt it as their answer.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to be able to have dialogues with people. That leads to the whole business of how you communicate, the Ask Me Everything sessions, and being plain spoken and clear with people about what's going on in the firm. So it was super helpful to me. The people that were the head of the firm before me saw the changes, and eventually at a very difficult time, I got the nod to become the CEO. But it was when we were really in some serious financial trouble, not to say also cultural trouble. So I became CEO. You know, if you're the CEO, you're supposed to have a strategy about what you do as a CEO. In the case of my career, becoming CEO, my strategy was carved out for me.
Right.
My job was to fix HOK, and I that became my mission. Once that mission was completed, I was at the top of my pyramid, and so I'm very proud of what I did. Very pleased that the firm, very pleased, ecstatic that the firm not only survived but is stronger than ever, and that culture was restored in a firm that straddles the globe like it does. When I stepped down, HOK typically does around 4,000 projects a year of all kinds, big and little, and architecture, engineering, planning, and interiors and consulting, and on and on and on. And I think it was 87 countries or something. My last year, and it's that's, if you want to have a diverse firm, wow, is that ever a diverse firm? The firm is also now about equal men and women, and there are women all over the firm in leadership positions, including right up at the top at the executive committee level. So, and running offices and running parts of the practice. So the firm is, I think, well positioned to do more, and I think more will be asked of HOK and other firms, because as I said earlier in our conversation, the world needs great design. It doesn't need struggling architects. It needs great design.
That is a beautiful summary. And I know we're coming up on our time. One final question from me, which unfortunately is a really big one. You know, your career spanned from 1960 or so, right? Up until 2000. Well, I mean, you're still going in a sense.
Yeah.
And the world has changed dramatically during that time.
Yes.
Technology has changed. The workplace has changed.
Yep.
Are there any big takeaways from you? Like, what was it like to go and see all that evolution? I mean, did it happen gradually? So for you, didn't feel like a change? Because from our perspective as a younger generation, it kind of blows my mind, really, the evolution.
Well, it was I guess you could say it was gradual. When I started at HOK in 1967. That was before most of your listeners and both of you were born. I know it for a fact. And it was a long time ago, and it was a different time. Architects were practicing by drawing three-dimensional buildings on two-dimensional sheets of paper. Or in HOK's case, because it was an innovative firm, it was two-dimensional sheets of mylar. That began to change. Well, and architects were just beginning. George Hellmuth was a pioneer in this, flying in airplanes to go meet clients. Until then, architecture was mostly a local practice. You practiced in the city in which your office was located. So those things were changing. I think 3 weeks after I joined the firm, or 4 weeks, they stuck a plane ticket in my hand and said, "We want you to fly to Pittsburgh with the project team to meet the client." Wow. Somebody would pay me to fly all the way from St. Louis to Pittsburgh to meet a client and put me in a hotel. I was in heaven. I loved it. And I've loved the travel ever since. I've always loved it. So that was new. The computer came later. The computer began to really come into its own in the 80s. HOK actually devised, Gio looked at early versions of AutoCAD and said, "This is for drafting. This isn't what we need. We need something to help us design." So HOK actually hired some programmers and developed what was called HOK Draw, which was a designing platform ran on Unix on workstations, and it was it was pretty clunky by today's standards, but it was revolutionary then. We actually used a bank of computers at McDonnell Douglas Corporation to crunch the numbers overnight. So we thought we were pretty hot stuff. At some point after that, HOK began to realize we're not in the software business, we're in the design business. So we gave up using HOK Draw eventually and adopted commercially available design tools. But in 1995, excuse me, I was given the job. I was brand new in the executive committee. And I said to my colleagues, the world is really changing fast. The computer is here to stay. The personal computer is now powerful enough to be used by architects for designing. And we better get with this. And so I was, of course, given the job. Well, why don't you figure it out? And I gathered together a few people in the firm that knew something about computers and software and technology. We came up with a 5-year plan called, naturally, we developed it in 95. We called it Tech 2000. Where do we want to be in 5 years? And it was revolutionary. I'll tell you something. It sounds so clear and so clunky now. Everybody needs a computer. We need to specialize on one platform. So we picked Windows. Why? Because all the CAD systems ran on Windows, not on Apple's operating system. And we needed a network. We needed a LAN, local area network, and we needed a WAN. These were names that I had to learn about. Everybody needed to have an email system. Wow, how are we going to do that? And we need to take all of our thousands and thousands of Kodachrome and Ektachrome slides in the slide library and get them digitized so we could begin to work digitally with the imagery that we had to do our selling and so on. And there were more parts to this, but when I showed this to the XCOM and showed them the price tag, they were astounded. Yeah. Said, this is really expensive. I said, well, no, it's not. People are expensive. These are just tools. And if we can get these in the hands of our people and get our people trained up, we will be one step ahead of this because the whole world is moving this way. So naturally, I was put in charge of implementing it. We actually had 2 people quit. One young lady quit because we asked her to give up her Mac computer for a clunky PC. And I understand it, but she quit. And we had 1 or 2 older employees that retired that said, I just don't want to learn anything this new. So we went through that bubble, that time when people were learning about computers. Now to a young person, it's ubiquitous. Everybody has one, and of course you have one. You might have several, and you got a smartphone, and you got tablets. And in those days, it was all new, and we just kept going. And we revised that plan, and again, I remember the day my CIO said, we've got so much material to store. I think we're going to be up to half of a terabyte. Half a terabyte. Wow. In my personal collection of photography and video, I think I have 5 terabytes today at home. So we learned, we grew, we continue to be, and I believe HOK continues to this day on the leading edge because technology is a sharp pencil. And fortunately, our ability to network across offices prepared HOK for this pandemic because business could carry on. People could work from home or in their office and communicate with themselves and with clients and carry on the work. So it positioned the firm well. And the other thing I'll finally say is working in 3 dimensions in BIM is finally freeing the architect up to do design thinking again, because the computer can do a lot of the hard crunching work to show us what things look like in 3D, but that's not the end of it. The real message to me about BIM is 3D designing is wonderful, but it's the data that's in the BIM, this ocean of information. It's so important that architects that are sharp are going to have to learn how to manage. How many square feet of this and that do we have? How many doors and windows? How many cubic yards of concrete? How many motors and generators and this and that? The computer is a marvelous thing about counting and keeping track of minutia that architects are not good at. If we manage it properly and learn how to seamlessly convey that back and forth with the contractor, and then at the end of construction, seamlessly convey that to the owner, so the owner has an intelligent system to operate the building, we can do buildings that begin to be as good as this. So we're not there, but we're on that path.
That's wonderful. What a full circle. That's great. We could easily keep talking for the next 2 hours, I believe. But this has been really fantastic. The book is great, and it's available now, correct?
Yes, it is. You can buy it on Amazon or from Wiley.
Yep. And it's, there you go. You got a copy. Perfect.
Yeah.
Designing a world-class architecture firm.
There it is. And
the people, stories, and strategies behind HOK. They're the founders behind their, and you can see this book I've referenced many times. It's got tabs in it. And again, it's a book. It's about designing a firm, not designing buildings. There are a few buildings in it, but it's mostly about people, stories, and strategies.
Yeah.
Was the intent. And I enjoyed writing it. Now I'm working on another book, but that's for another day.
That sounds good. Let us know when that comes out. Maybe you can come back on.
Of course. That'd be a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to this week's episode of The Second Studio. Ooh, new name. That new name smell. Thanks to our guest, Patrick MacLeamy, for coming on the show. He was really, really fantastic. And I would like to also say that even though we covered a lot of different things on the show with Patrick, and he had a lot of stories, advice, insights to give, his book has a lot more, so it's definitely worthwhile checking out and buying. It is available on Amazon, I believe, and wherever else Google says it's available, right? That's how you do it. You know what I mean? And okay, your turn to talk. Yeah.
We are on all of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. A lot of our interviews are actually video as well. And if you go on our YouTube channel, you could watch them. Yep.
And at this point, all of that should have changed or will soon be changing from the Midnight Charrette or the handles Midnight Charrette to
Obviously.
Second Studio Pod, right? Second Studio Pod is for Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and I believe YouTube. And we also have a website where you can find all of our recordings, and that will soon be secondstudiopod.com.
Right.
Hotline.
We also have the hotline available, 213-222-6950. You can call and leave a voicemail or send us a text message. If you have any suggestions for topics, guests, or you want to react to an episode or the rebranding, feel free to reach out.
Also, if you like this show or you like this episode, then support us by leaving a review in the iTunes podcast app.
Yes.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we will talk to you again next week or sooner. Bye.
Bye-bye.